3 words. That is all it took. 3 words delivered by a sergeant of the British Eighth Army to an American officer who had just stepped off a transport ship at a port in North Africa and handed him a set of operational orders. The American had rank. He had a clean uniform, a clean shave, and the full authority of a military structure that had just arrived in theater with 200,000 soldiers, more equipment than the British had seen in 3 years of fighting, and the absolute conviction that it was about to win the war that Britain had been bleeding through since 1939. The sergeant looked at the orders, looked at the officer, and said 3 words. "You just got here." He was not reprimanded, not immediately. The officer standing in front of him had never heard a German 88mm shell. He had never watched a tank burn from the inside out in the afternoon heat of the Libyan desert. He had never counted the dead after a night retreat across ground you had won 6 months before and then lost again and were now fighting over for the 3rd time. The sergeant had done all of those things. And the officer, clean uniform, new boots, and a map he had not yet learned to read by starlight, had not. That was the entire argument. It was also the beginning of one of the most complex and consequential command relationships in the history of the Western Alliance. To understand why British veterans of the Desert War regarded freshly arrived American officers with something that fell somewhere between polite contempt and open insubordination, you have to understand what those veterans had been through before the Americans arrived. Not in the abstract sense of acknowledging that the war had been difficult, but in the specific operational bone-grinding sense of what 3 years of fighting in North Africa had done to the men who survived it. The North African campaign of the Second World War took place across a span of roughly 3 years, from June 1940 to May 1943, and consumed the deserts of Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia in one of the most attritional campaigns of the entire conflict. For a long period during the early years of the war, this was the only theater where the United Kingdom could strike back against the Axis powers. And the Seesaw Desert War, fought along the coast of the Mediterranean, proved a harsh testing ground for British arms in terms of organization, equipment, and methods of waging war. What that meant in human terms was this. Men who had enlisted in 1939 and 1940 had spent years in a landscape that killed without mercy, regardless of which side was firing. Troops had to survive extremely high daytime temperatures and very cold nights. Newly arrived men generally spent time acclimatizing in the Nile Delta before moving into the desert. Disease also took a toll on the troops, who were constantly irritated by millions of flies attracted by food, human waste, and dead bodies. The ground itself was indifferent to human suffering in a way that soldiers from temperate climates could not have imagined before they arrived. Heat exhaustion killed men who sat still. Dehydration took them overnight if the water lorry was late. Sand found its way into every mechanism, every wound, every piece of food. Men who survived the Western Desert for more than a year had built an understanding of that environment that was not transferable by briefing, by map, or by manual. It was held in the body. It was held in reflex. You could not give it to a man who had just stepped off a ship. Desert veterans taught the newcomers what was called desert sense, the ability to best survive the extremes in temperature, cook and wash without waste, conserve fresh water, attend to the needs of vehicles, navigate using the stars and sharp eyes that picked out meager landmarks in the seemingly featureless desert, and above all, to respect the enemy. That last part was the critical one: respect for the enemy. By the time the Americans arrived in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the British had been fighting Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps for 20 months. They had beaten the Italians comprehensively, stripped them of their Libyan colony in what seemed like a single devastating sweep, and then encountered something entirely different when Rommel landed at Tripoli in February 1941. Not only did the EC's Germans have a daring and imaginative commander in Rommel, but also for several months their tactics proved superior. The main problem for the British was the lack of cooperation between their armor and infantry, meaning they were fighting almost separate battles. The result was that the infantry did not receive the support it might have done, and the armor frequently fell victim to coordinated enemy attacks. The Africa Corps had then proceeded to hand the Eighth Army a sequence of experiences that can only be described, without exaggeration, as a rolling education in military catastrophe. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942, which sent 93,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers into captivity, and which Churchill received the news of while sitting with President Roosevelt in the White House, was the worst British military disaster since the fall of Singapore 4 months earlier. At the end of May 1942, the Germans launched a fresh offensive and, after 2 weeks of heavy fighting, broke through the British line. They captured Tobruk and pushed the British back into Egypt. The retreat from Tobruk to El Alamein was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a rout conducted under constant pressure, with units disintegrating, commanders losing contact with their formations, and the men who survived it carrying something that no subsequent briefing could erase. They had run across ground they had already paid for in blood. They had done it because the Germans were better at their job. And then they had stopped at El Alamein in July 1942, held the line, and begun the long, painful process of learning how to be better themselves. The horrendous British casualties of 1914 to 1918 helped explain Montgomery's caution as a commander 25 years later. The entire senior British command structure in North Africa by 1942 was composed of men who had been junior officers in the First World War, who had watched their generation cut apart on the Somme and at Passchendaele and at Gallipoli, and who carried those lessons like a weight on every operational decision they made. You did not commit troops until you were ready. You did not advance until your supply lines could support the advance. You did not waste men on gestures. This made British commanders look cautious to the Americans, who brought with them a completely different military culture, rooted in a nation that had entered both world wars late, had never been invaded, and had never watched its industrial cities bombed flat over the course of 2 consecutive winters. When the Americans finally arrived in force in November 1942, during 1942, as the United States began its engagement in the long build-up, 100,000 U.S. military personnel landed in Britain. Mindful of the adage that it is always impolite to criticize your hosts and militarily stupid to criticize your allies, the U.S. War Office produced a 6-page cultural guide in the hope of minimizing clashes. The first concern was to emphasize cautiously that the USA was a late arrival into this war, explaining that thousands of British citizens had already lost their homes in Blitz bombing, and that the whole nation was involved directly in the struggle. The pamphlet was honest about the gap in experience. What it could not bridge was the attitude that some American officers carried with them across the Atlantic, the attitude that the British had been fighting for 3 years and had not yet managed to win, and that the arrival of American manpower and American industrial production would now sort out what British military incompetence had left unresolved. This attitude was not universal among American commanders. It was not even the majority view. But it was present, it was detectable, and it arrived in North Africa at the worst possible moment, right at the point where the British Eighth Army had just achieved its first major decisive victory at El Alamein, and was marching west in pursuit of a retreating Rommel, having finally, after 20 months of bloody apprenticeship, worked out how to beat the Germans in the open desert. In November 1942, Rommel's much-vaunted Panzerarmee Africa was decisively defeated by the British Eighth Army at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Rommel's setback was not merely a defeat, but a full-scale rout, and surviving German and Italian units were forced into a headlong retreat through the burning deserts of northern Libya. The Axis disaster at El Alamein coincided with Operation Torch, 3 coordinated Allied landings in French North Africa at Casablanca, in Morocco, and at Oran and Algiers, in Algeria. The timing created the fundamental psychological tension that would define British-American relations at the operational level for the next 12 months. The British had just won. They had ground out a victory at El Alamein that had cost them 13,000 casualties over 10 days, and they were now rolling west in the largest sustained advance the Desert War had seen, driving Rommel and what remained of his army across the entire length of Libya. By January 1943, Rommel had retreated some 1,400 miles across the spine of northern Africa. Montgomery's Eighth Army captured Tripoli on January 23, 1943, the objective of every British offensive since 1940. The men doing this advancing were not the same men who had retreated to El Alamein 6 months earlier. They were harder. They were more confident. They had beaten Rommel's veterans, and they knew it. And they had spent years in conditions that had made them something that the clean, well-equipped, well-fed Americans stepping off their transports could not yet claim to be. They were desert soldiers. The desert was theirs. They had paid for it in a currency the Americans had not yet been charged. Although the British people, for the most part, were glad to see the American servicemen, there were complications and resentments. The British people had been at war for over 2 years and were well used to going without and making do. When the Americans arrived, their stomachs were full, and so were their pockets. The popular British phrase about the GIs being overpaid, oversexed, and over here brilliantly summed up many of the tensions the encounter threw up, over money and lifestyles, courtship rituals, and the treatment of local women, over sovereignty and the American impulse to requisition every local resource they could get their hands on. An American private soldier in 1942 was paid roughly 3 times the equivalent British rate. He arrived with new kit, new vehicles, new weapons, and the cheerful confidence of a man who has not yet learned that cheerful confidence is the first casualty of sustained combat. The initial pour showing by green American troops in North Africa had convinced many in the King's Army that Roosevelt's boys were undertrained, poorly motivated, and just plain inept. That verdict was not delivered without evidence. On the 19th of February 1943, it arrived with catastrophic force. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a series of engagements which took place from 19 to 24 February 1943 around Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile-wide gap in the grand dorsal chain of the Atlas Mountains in west-central Tunisia. It was part of the Tunisian campaign of the Second World War. The action saw the German Africa Corps' assault group under Rommel, reinforced by the Italian Centauro Armored Division and 2 panzer divisions from the 5th Panzer Army, defeat elements of the U.S. Second Corps and the British 6th Armored Division at the Kasserine Pass. What happened at Kasserine was not simply a military defeat, though the military dimension of it was severe enough. When Eisenhower first faced the Germans in Tunisia in February 1943, his forces took a brutal beating in the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The battle is regarded by some as the most humiliating U.S. combat setback in the Second World War, with American forces suffering more than 6,000 casualties. The loss was so devastating that British allies began to question Americans' ability to fight. The man commanding the American forces at Kasserine, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had never visited the ground his troops were defending. Fredendall was 80 miles away, plotting his battle tactics on a map. If he had been on the scene, he might have realized that the hills on which he was perching his infantry regiments were too far apart for those units to support each other or the tanks on the flat ground below them. Rommel realized it, and the soldiers of the Eighth Army, who had spent months learning exactly that lesson under fire, who had lost men and ground and commanders to the experience of discovering that the Germans did not telegraph their intentions, who had built their understanding of the Africa Corps from the bodies of their own dead, looked at what had happened at Kasserine and drew conclusions that would take years to fully overcome. The GIS should have remembered what the British had learned the hard way: never underestimate the Germans. Soon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, admiringly dubbed the Desert Fox by the British, would teach the rookie Americans a lesson on the art of war at a dusty defile called Kasserine Pass. It was Rommel who said of the Americans that he had never seen troops so badly prepared for combat, yet learned so quickly. The aftermath of Kasserine accelerated the command friction that was already brewing. Friction began to emerge between British and American commanders that was significant enough to require intervention by Eisenhower and Alexander. In the aftermath of Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Second Corps passed to the command of General Harold Alexander's 18th Army Group. When Alexander took command on February 20, 1943, one of his first tasks was to assess Second Corps' combat readiness after its setbacks. What Alexander found was an American corps that had been badly led, badly deployed, and badly beaten. What he did about it told the story of exactly how the British perceived the situation. He assigned battle-hardened liaison officers from the British Eighth Army to the American units. These included the assignment of battle-hardened liaison officers from the British Eighth Army to Second Corps, replacement of the underpowered American 37mm anti-tank gun with the British 6-pounder. The message embedded in that action, politely wrapped in the language of Allied cooperation, was direct. You need to learn from us, because what you have been doing has not worked, and we have been doing this long enough to know what does. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, replaced Fredendall with General George S. Patton. The Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower replaced the American Commander Fredendall with the Able Corps' Commander Patton, who had proven himself worthy during the Operation Torch landings. He reorganized his forces to work together in a more cohesive fashion, shook up his intelligence operation, and brought in the brash, aggressive Patton to shape up the U.S. Army's ground combat force in Tunisia. Patton understood what had gone wrong. He drove the fix with the ruthless energy that was his defining characteristic, demanding physical standards, tactical discipline, and the kind of aggressive forward engagement that the Americans had not yet shown they were capable of. But Patton's arrival also intensified a different problem, because Patton was not a man who accepted British condescension quietly, and he perceived condescension where it was not always intended. The command structure above the fighting units had its own version of the same tension. Eisenhower had been thrust into command of 500,000 men and had to keep the peace between his feuding collection of Americans, British, and French generals. This was not a metaphorical challenge. The command structure of the Allied forces in Tunisia was a genuinely fractured arrangement. In theory, General Anderson had 3 corps under his command: General Alfrey's British 5th Corps, General Coltz's French 19th Corps, and General Fredendall's American 2nd Corps. But the French refused to take Anderson's orders. Instead, they obeyed General Juin, who in turn was under General Giraud. Any serious coordination with the French thus involved passing orders up and down a chain of command which stretched all the way back to Algiers. If the French were refusing orders from British generals and routing their compliance through their own national command structure, the Americans were doing something subtler but equally corrosive. They were accepting the formal chain of command while challenging its legitimacy in every meeting, every briefing, and every casual exchange between officers in mess tents and planning rooms across Tunisia. The British had been there longer. The British had the experience. But the Americans had more men, more equipment, and a growing conviction that by the time the war ended, it would be American power, not British experience, that delivered the final victory. The North African and Italian campaigns of 1942 and 1943 were the last time that British and Commonwealth forces would contribute the bulk of Allied military might. By 1944, with America fully mobilized and Britain running out of manpower, the Americans would be the senior partner, and the British knew it. Both sides were right. That was the essential problem. The British veterans were right that their experience was real, hard-won, and not replicable by a month of desert training. The Americans were right that their industrial capacity and their inexhaustible manpower would ultimately determine the outcome of the war in Europe. Both facts were true simultaneously, and they pointed in different directions about who should be giving orders to whom. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery inhabited this contradiction in the most visible and abrasive form of any British commander. He was better known for his outstanding professionalism and sense of balance than for his talents in getting on with his contemporaries, notably the American ones. Montgomery had rebuilt the Eighth Army from a demoralized formation on the verge of another retreat into a disciplined instrument that had beaten Rommel at El Alamein. He had done this by insisting on meticulous preparation, complete logistics, overwhelming force applied at the chosen point, and the absolute refusal to commit his troops before he judged the moment right. These were the lessons the desert had taught him at enormous cost, and he applied them with the single-mindedness of a man who had watched too many British soldiers die from commanders going too early with too little. To American commanders, this looked like hesitation. It looked like caution dressed up as methodology. It looked like the British habit of building a perfect plan and then executing it with insufficient aggression to take advantage of the moment. Failure to capture Caen in the first days marred his reputation in American eyes. Rashly, he insisted that everything was going according to plan. Yet it was his basic strategy of wearing down the Germans on the left flank, while American forces broke out in the west, that led to victory in Normandy. The truth of Normandy was that the two approaches were genuinely complementary. The British and Canadian armies were to decoy the enemy reserves and draw them to their front on the extreme eastern edge of the Allied beachhead. Thus, while Montgomery taunted the enemy at Caen, the Americans were to make the break. When reckoned in terms of national pride, this British decoy mission became a sacrificial one, for while the Americans tramped around the outside flank, the British were to sit in place and pin down the Germans. Yet strategically, it fitted into a logical division of labors, for it was towards Caen that the enemy reserves would race once the alarm was sounded. But strategy and ego operate on different timetables, and the American press, fed by American commanders who felt they were being subordinated to a British general who took all the credit for Allied victories while American infantry did the dying, was not interested in the logic of the pinning operation. Patton and Bradley thought Eisenhower believed Montgomery and the British were better than the Americans, and that they should be the ones who led the Americans to victory. One of Patton's staff officers summed up the American frustration. "We are left to sit comfortably on our backsides while Montgomery finishes the war." Patton had his own relationship with the British that defied easy categorization. He competed with Montgomery with the ferocity of a man who took personal competition as seriously as operational planning. When the invasion of Sicily was planned in the summer of 1943, prior to the invasion, Montgomery used his influence to have the plan altered to give the Eighth Army the primary objective of Messina, reducing Patton's command to a supporting role. Patton never forgot the slight, the first of several, either real or imagined. Patton responded the way Patton always responded to being told to wait. He ignored the assignment and raced for Messina. Many people saw what Patton did by driving to Palermo and then Messina as a great feat in military history, because Patton drove west to Palermo on the opposite side of Sicily, then drove to Messina before Montgomery could arrive from the south. He sideswiped the corps westward and then sent it northwestward to Palermo. Turning eastward along the northern shore of the island, he reached and took the ultimate goal of Messina before Montgomery. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had once quipped that Britain and America were two peoples divided by a common language, but it went far beyond that. Differences in equipment and tactical doctrine, plus the attitudes and personalities of the commanding generals, had major impacts on the campaign. By 1944, the power shift that everyone had seen coming had arrived. Eisenhower took overall command of Allied land forces as Supreme Commander. The Broad Front controversy in 1944 arose after Eisenhower decided to advance into Germany on a broad front, against the suggestions of his principal subordinates, Generals Bradley and Patton, and Field Marshal Montgomery, who argued instead to stage competing advances on narrow fronts. The decision was controversial because the British government wanted to raise the profile of the minority British contingent in what was by then an overwhelmingly American army, and they perceived that a British-led thrust to Berlin would achieve this aim. Montgomery's strident advocacy raised political and nationalistic complications that strained the wartime alliance. The numbers told the story that no argument could override. In late 1944, two legendary generals stood at the helm of the Allied Expeditionary Force as it plunged into Nazi Germany. While the relationship between the United States and Britain, and more specifically between Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery, are portrayed as cooperative and friendly, personal memoirs of the two men and their close confidants reveal that these myths could not be further from the truth. Montgomery's position as ground commander of the Allied land forces had been formally handed to Eisenhower in September 1944. Relations with Eisenhower, remarkably good up to D-Day, deteriorated beginning in September 1944, following Eisenhower's assumption of overall command of strategies to end the war. What had happened was not simply a power struggle between two difficult generals. It was the visible expression at the command level of exactly the same tension that the 8th Army sergeant had articulated with 3 words to a clean-uniformed American officer in a North African port. When you arrived mattered. The war's experience was not evenly distributed. The British had carried it longer, at higher relative cost, with less relative power. During Eisenhower's 1942 to 1945 tenure as Supreme Allied Commander, his greatest detractor and harshest critic was Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Britain's wartime chief of the Imperial General Staff. Although the acerbic Brooke was highly critical of many leading Allied figures, he confined most of his unflattering remarks about British leaders to the privacy of his wartime diary. He was much less secretive about his disdain for Eisenhower, however, and shared his stinging criticisms of Ike with Churchill, Montgomery, and others. Brooke's criticism of Eisenhower was not simply personal. It was rooted in a specific British grievance: that Eisenhower had little combat experience before taking Allied command, and that the Americans were making strategic decisions for a theater that the British had opened, fought across, and paid for in blood, while the Americans were still learning which direction the Germans attacked from. Brooke began criticizing Eisenhower's leadership during the 1942 to 1943 North African campaign, when Ike first exercised Allied command. In fairness to Brooke, Eisenhower did make mistakes in his initial effort at coalition command. Logistics were a mess. Anglo-American cooperation at the operational level was poor, and Ike failed to exercise firm direction. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 brought the tension to its most public and damaging point. When German armor broke through American lines in the Ardennes, Eisenhower temporarily assigned the northern flank of the broken front to Montgomery, giving him command of the American First Army. Montgomery conducted a press conference afterwards in which he implied, with the habitual tone deafness that defined his public communications, that he had personally rescued the Americans from the mess they had made. Montgomery's press briefing painted him as the architect of Allied victory, downplaying American achievements. This self-congratulatory tone angered American commanders. Eisenhower had to intervene to calm the rising tensions. Montgomery was tactlessly critical of the American reverse in the Ardennes of December 1944. The political damage was severe enough that American commanders, Patton among them, formally approached Eisenhower with what amounted to an ultimatum. Either Montgomery withdrew the implication or they would request his removal from command. Eisenhower drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff that would effectively have forced Churchill to choose between the alliance and his most celebrated general. Montgomery backed down, The cable was never sent. Critical of Eisenhower's broad front strategy, Montgomery clamored for more men and supplies. When Eisenhower relented to Montgomery's call for a combined ground and airborne offensive in Holland that could end the war by Christmas, 1944, the result was the disastrous Operation Market Garden. The bold but disastrous airborne coup at Arnhem, the only battle Montgomery ever lost, further dented his reputation. And yet, the British argument was not simply national vanity dressed in military language. The British veterans who looked at American officers and said, quietly or otherwise, that they had just arrived, were making a point about something real, something that casualty figures and operational records confirmed in ways that the loudest American complaints could not entirely rebut. The entire Allied force was restructured from top to bottom after Kasserine. The Americans had needed the British to tell them what they had not yet learned. Even the U.S. defeat at Kasserine may have been paradoxically advantageous. Rommel and the Axis were lulled into a false impression of U.S. capabilities, while the Americans learned valuable lessons and made positive changes in their command structure and tactics. The learning was real, and it was fast. Rommel said of the Americans that he had never seen troops so badly prepared for combat, yet learned so quickly. By the summer of 1943, the American Second Corps that had been broken at Kasserine had been rebuilt into an effective fighting force capable of taking on the Afrika Korps and winning. By Normandy, American operational planning had absorbed the lessons of the Mediterranean and was producing campaign execution that the British acknowledged, even if they did not always admit it publicly, had exceeded their expectations. The broad front strategy that Montgomery condemned was the strategy that ultimately drove Germany to surrender. The individual American divisions that the British had assessed as undertrained and overconfident in 1942 were, by 1944, some of the most experienced ground forces in the Western world. There is a particular truth about coalition warfare that the British-American friction of the Second World War illustrated with unusual clarity. The concept of chiefs in command of all Allied forces in their geographical zone was new in military history, one promoted by General Marshall and accepted reluctantly at first by the British. Every nation that enters a coalition brings with it not just soldiers and equipment, but a history, a set of institutional memories, a weight of experience that shapes how it expects to be treated and how it treats others. When Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Arcadia Conference, they began a period of wartime cooperation that, for all the very serious differences that divided the two countries, remains without parallel in military history. That cooperation was real, and it was decisive. The combined chiefs of staff made it work at the strategic level through months when the personal relationships between American and British commanders were corrosive enough to have fractured lesser alliances. Anglo-American cooperation was formally embodied in the combined chiefs of staff, which was not so much a body as a system of consultation reinforced by frequent conferences between the British Chiefs of Staff Committee and the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the system worked because it had to, not because the people inside it had resolved the underlying tensions. Those tensions were never fully resolved. They were managed, suppressed, papered over with diplomatic language, sublimated into competitive military effectiveness, and occasionally detonated in press conferences and private memoranda that read today like dispatches from a war within the war. Personal memoirs of both Eisenhower and Montgomery and their close confidants reveal that the myths of smooth cooperation could not be further from the truth. A debate that began as one regarding military strategy escalated into a full-blown feud. This tension was a reflection of a relationship that relied on compromise. The 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats who had been in the field since 1940, spent the final months of 1943 being shipped back to England. By the time the division returned home in late 1943, it had lost hundreds of men in nearly 3 years of uninterrupted warfare in the Mediterranean. Those who survived knew that their only reward would be more campaigning in Western Europe. The divisional veterans were of the firm opinion that they had done their bit. Now it was up to the other divisions, which had spent the war years training in the comparative safety of England, to step up. That sentiment, the bone-deep conviction of men who had given everything they could give and watched younger, fresher, less worn men arrive to take their place in a war they had started, was the emotional core of the entire British-American relationship at the human level. It was not strategic. It was not operational. It was the feeling of a man who has been standing in a doorway, blocking the wind for 3 years, watching someone who has never felt cold tell him how it should be done. The loss at Kasserine was so devastating that British allies began to question Americans' ability to fight. The British were right to question it, and the Americans were right to be outraged by the questioning, and both were right because both things were simultaneously true. The Americans could not fight in 1943 the way the Eighth Army could fight in 1943, because they had not yet paid what the Eighth Army had paid for that ability. And the Eighth Army, looking at the Americans in 1943, could not yet see what the Americans would become by 1944 and 1945, because that process of becoming had not yet happened. The sergeant's 3 words were accurate. You just got here. The American officer, clean boots, clean map, fresh orders from a command structure that had not yet learned to read the desert, had indeed just arrived. He would arrive for years. He would arrive with more men, more tanks, more aircraft, more fuel, more food than the British could imagine. He would arrive and he would learn, and he would eventually fight with a skill and a tenacity that would break the Wehrmacht in Western Europe. But he was not there yet when the sergeant said it. And the sergeant, who had been there through the losing as well as the winning, through the retreats and the counterattacks and the flies and the heat and the long nights navigating by stars to reach positions that might already be gone by the time you got there, was not wrong to notice the difference. The alliance held. It held through Kasserine and through Sicily, and through the arguments about Market Garden and the press conferences after the Bulge and the bitter back and forth over who should command what and who deserved credit for which victory. It held because at the level where it mattered most, at the level of men who actually fought the war, the mutual respect that the institutional rivalry struggled to kill kept reasserting itself. Allied soldiers give each other a lot of crap, but when the shooting starts, that disappears. When the shooting started, the British soldiers and the American soldiers bled on the same ground, treated each other's wounded with the same field dressings, and shared the same foxholes in the same rainstorms. The contempt was a surface phenomenon over something much deeper, something that the generals with their press conferences and their memoirs and their operational disagreements could not dismantle because it was not built from strategy. It was built from the fact that they were all there. However late some of them had arrived, they were all there. The war ended in May 1945. The Axis forces in North Africa surrendered on 13th May 1943, yielding over 275,000 prisoners of war. The men who accepted that surrender on behalf of the Allies included British Eighth Army veterans who had been in the desert since the first Italian invasion of Egypt in 1940, and American soldiers who had arrived 6 months earlier and been beaten at Kasserine and rebuilt themselves into something that Rommel himself acknowledged he had never seen before. They shook hands over the wire of the prisoner compound and walked away in different directions and told different stories about what had happened. The stories were both true. The war had created 2 versions of the same truth, separated by the number of months each man had been present when the shooting was happening. What you had seen before you got here determined everything about how you fought, how you led, how you judged those around you, and whether 3 words in a North African port landed like a reprimand or like a simple statement of fact. You just got here. Both things were the beginning of something. For the Americans, it was the beginning of 3 more years of fighting that would turn them into the most formidable ground force in the Western world. For the British, it was the beginning of the long negotiation of power that would define the special relationship for the rest of the century. For the sergeant, it was another day in the desert. He had been there since the beginning. He would be there until the end.